Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. So in the last video, I had mentioned that I had a little bit of an issue with a couple of the shocks on Midnight Panic. So I figured I'd jump on here and do a relatively short video of what I've got going on with the shock package on the truck. Now, after Duchesne, I noticed that I had a couple of shocks that were leaving the puddles of oil in the truck. And that was relatively new. But what wasn't new is the fact that these shocks have always kind of weeped, or they've just left a little bit of oil on the shock shafts whenever the truck gets used. So after every show, every run, there's just a little bit of like a film of oil on the shock shafts. Now, most of the other trucks that I've been around actually do not do that. So I figured there was something kind of going on with these. Now, my plan is to go through these shocks, freshen up the seals, take the opportunity to see what valving is in the shocks. But that's actually a pretty big project when you have to pull all the shocks off the truck, go through everything. If you need to order parts, say seals or any of the valving shims, any of that, the truck is just sitting here basically unusable with the shocks off and all of these shocks torn apart here on the bench. So what I decided to do was go ahead and order a whole nother set of shocks.
Must be nice.
Now, not only does that make it so I can keep the truck up and going, pretty much throughout the whole process of working on these shocks, but that also gives me the opportunity to throw a couple of these in the trailer and have them as a kind of an emergency spare. Say we do something in the truck to where I damage a shock shaft or blow the cap off of a reservoir, something like that. We could actually pop one of these shocks off the truck, slap one of these on, and be ready to go in just a matter of minutes, really. Now, I'm not going to tear into these shocks or do any rebuild stuff like that on this video, I don't think. But mostly it's just about swapping these new shocks here in place on the truck. As you can see, I've got 4 of them out here on the table, and that's because I already have the 4 front shocks installed. Now, as you can see, visually, there is quite a bit of difference between the shocks that are laying on the table here. These shocks here are actually the ones I originally bought for the project for the truck years ago. It's a pretty reputable brand. There's a lot of trucks that run these shocks. However, every time I try to get anything for these shocks from this manufacturer, it always turns into, oh, that's an old design. We're going to have to do a custom part to fix those shocks. As a matter of fact, I talked to a dealer that deals with the manufacturer of these shocks about fixing this leak issue. If I could get rebuild kits or seals or shims. And basically all I was told was I would be better off to ship these shocks back to the manufacturer. They'll repair them, update them, and send them back. They want basically $650 just for the labor. And then they said that it'll probably need new seal heads, new seals, and then possibly new shock shafts. Well, I can tell you right now, to ship this stuff back and forth is going to cost a couple $1,000. And then on top of that, who knows what they're going to think needs replaced, so I'll get charged for that. As far as just putting new seals in, I have a feeling that this is probably a part that you can get from a hydraulic shop or something along those lines. So I'll probably be better off to just disassemble these things, source the parts, and then make the repairs myself. Now, these shocks here on the other side of the table are above all fabrication shocks, and these are, so far from what I've seen, are a very nice shock. Any of you guys that are in the mega truck world or watch any of that know that Dustin makes some pretty incredible parts. And I reached out to him because I just know how he is about his parts, how he is about the trucks that he builds, and I knew that his quality probably exceeds my own, which is really good. So I reached out to Dustin, asked him what the lead time was on a set of shocks, because as you can imagine, it's not something you just pick up the phone and order and they throw them on the truck the next day. For the most part, usually these are custom build, whether it be the valving or however you want orientation. You can see some of these are top feed accumulators or bottom feed accumulators. But fortunately for me, Dustin had 4 of the 8 shocks sitting on the shelf ready to go. And then he said he could put 4 more together, by the next day. So actually, these things were like 2 days out and they were on the truck headed my way. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's pretty incredible for this type of part. So obviously I just sent him the money and he got the shocks headed my direction. Now, as far as the nuts and the bolts between the, any variations between the two, for the most part, they're, basically the same shock. They're both 3-inch body shocks, 26-inch travel. These shocks here from Dustin are actually have a little bit bigger reservoir on them. But for the most part, the mounting is the same. They all run 3/4 inch heims on the ends. And then, the body lengths are slightly longer on the Above All or Dustin shocks, but nothing that is going to, be a hindrance or a problem as far as installing them on the truck. It's actually a little bit better because the travel of the shock will actually work better for the bigger tire with the bodywork on the truck. These shocks here, the truck was actually able to bottom out a bit more. So the tire was actually just getting closer to the bodywork. That's how you end up with stuff like this in the corners of the fenders. These shocks here, they'll actually bottom out just a touch sooner. So I will have to make some adjustments with my bump stops, but it's all really for the better as far as I'm concerned. Now, even though for the most part, it's just a bolt-in direct swap to go from this shock here to this shock here, but there are a couple little details that I'm going to have to figure out with this new setup. So what I'm going to do now is grab the camera and take you back here to the shocks. The original shocks are on the back of the truck, and try and explain kind of what I got going on there. Now, one of the little projects that I'm going to have to sort out for the new shocks, you can see this diagonal link right here. So what most guys run is actually kind of like a little clamp or a couple of plates on the front and the back side of the shock to keep your shocks from rotating. Like if this reservoir right here, if this shock turns and this reservoir rotates too far back, it can actually interfere with this anti-sway bar arm and this link right here. You don't want these two making contact. And then also, even if you didn't have this in the way, this could roll around, break the jam nut loose on the top. This could get into the chassis. They could swing out and get into the tires. So I have this link in here, and it actually ties the two shocks together. You can see they kind of rotate together, but they're actually limited how much they can move. There's enough movement there, so nothing combined or tear anything up, but it can't rotate far enough to get into the chassis or the tire or into this sway bar arm here. So that is all that link is doing. It doesn't need to have a lot, but the clamps, the clamps between the shock body and the reservoir are considerably different on the new shocks. So I'm going to have to sort that out. I'm not sure if I can necessarily use something like that on the new setup. However, my cap retainers, those should work on the new shocks. So that's good. I don't have to build new ones of those. I can just swap these over to the new ones. These are the jam nuts I was talking about. If it rotates too much, it can break that jam nut loose, and then the shocks are free to rotate without anything retaining them. Like I said, most trucks you'll see a strap go all the way across there and tie those together. Me personally, I don't really like the thought of having something clamping all of these together because, as it moves throughout the suspension cycle, this distance between the shocks can change very slightly. I mean, it's very minimal. And obviously, there's enough guys running that setup that it's not a big deal. It's proven to work. I just don't really particularly care for that setup myself. If I have to go that route, that's what I have to do. But I'm going to put a little bit of effort into something different before, I go that route. Now, if we come up here on the front, you can see I actually have to have this one rotated out quite a bit to clear the anti-sway bar arm and link. So this is even more challenging because you can't just go straight off of the tube clamps, the reservoir clamps, like I did on the rear. Now, the biggest reason that I can't do on the back that I can't do the same setup is because these are actually a lot nicer clamp than the other shocks have, the original shocks. So basically, I just don't have room to be able to use that rod end back in. I would have to space it out far enough, and then you start getting more leverage on the bolt. I'm just not really sure what I'm going to do there. I could possibly drill and tap farther out here so that the actual there's no interference with that little rod end and that link. And I might be able to do that on the front here, even though this one is rotated out so much. I might be able to drill and tap a hole there and do that same link here on the front. But that's a little bit later down in the project. What I need to do right now is actually get the shocks off the back of the truck off here on the table and then get all of those installed. Now I've got all 4 shocks here on the back of the truck. They're all bolted up, mounted in place, and they're actually ready to charge with nitrogen. To charge them with nitrogen, we're gonna have to raise the truck up to ride height. I've got my bottle set up here and everything's hooked up. The jack's ready to raise the truck up. But before we get into charging the shocks, let's go over to the table where one of the old shocks is laying there. I'll extend it out and I'll try and explain to you what is going on with the nitrogen in the shock itself. Now, most of you guys are probably going to understand this better than I can actually explain it. So forgive me if I kind of go on repeat here a little bit when I'm talking about this stuff. Just trying to get the information out there as clearly as possible anyway. So what we're looking at here is one of the front shocks that were on the truck. It's fully extended out here, mostly just for visual purposes. But there are a couple of components that are really important on this shock. So you've got your shock shaft. You've got the main body of the shock, and then you've got the reservoir. This is where we charge the nitrogen. So this is actually a high pressure valve here. And then inside there is a piston, just a floating piston that separates the nitrogen from the oil. And the oil is actually whatever is not filled with nitrogen in the reservoir is filled with oil. And then the entire shock itself is filled with oil. On the end of the rod or the shaft of the shock, you've got your piston, and then it's got your valving. So the valving is what is controlling either your compression or your rebound. As this shock shaft travels through here, it's pushing that oil through the shims on the piston one direction or the other, depending on where the shock is actually moving. Now, the reservoir itself is actually kind of serves 2 purposes. The most important part actually is the fact that when this shock shaft is compressed, it has to displace that oil. So as it comes into the body, you run out of room for that oil. So as it displaces the oil, it comes through this fitting and it actually pushes that piston against the nitrogen that's in this end of the reservoir. Now that does a couple of things. One, your nitrogen charge is putting pressure on your shock oil, and that helps keep from aerating or creating air bubbles in your shock oil as the piston and shims are moving through the oil. And then on these shocks in particular, that pressure that is in this reservoir working against the oil that's in the shock is actually directly related to the area of this shock shaft. So not counting any of the valving or the piston or any of that, because the piston and the valving, the oil can move through. So even though the piston and shims moving through the oil create resistance, it doesn't stop the oil. The oil can still flow through that. What the oil cannot flow through is the end of this shaft. So if you were to pop this out and take the piston and the shims and everything off the end of it, minus the threaded hole, you would end up basically looking at that. That's a piece of 1.5 inch shaft, same diameter as the shock shaft here. So that's the effective area that your oil and your pressure is working against right here. Now you can actually take and do a little bit of math here. We can figure out what that area is. Everyone knows pi r squared gives you the square area on the end of that shaft. Or you can take diameter times 0.7854 and end up with the same answer. So right here, we know this is inch and a half shock shaft. So you take 1.5 inches times 1.5 inches times 0.7854, and you get 1.767 square inches. That is the number that your oil is working on, your nitrogen pressure is working on against the end of that shaft. So on this truck right here, on the front of the truck, the shock shafts here, I know that I have to air those up. I have to charge those shocks to 345 PSI in each shock to actually hold the weight of the truck up. So if you take that 1.76, which is the area of the shaft, times that by 345 PSI, each one of those shocks is holding up 609 pounds. Just kind of a little bit of interesting tech. You can kind of figure out what the front of this thing weighs. We know the front unsprung corner on here is essentially 1,218 pounds, each corner. Now, if you don't have this PSI number, I guess technically you could figure it out. I could have used my scales on my hoist there, hooked onto the front of the truck, lifted it up, got a a rough guesstimate on the unsprung weight of the truck. Take that number, divide it by 4, then divide by this 1.767, and then I would have ended up with the amount of nitrogen I would have to charge to hold this truck up. Fortunately, I've already done all that stuff, last year when I was doing all this, and the number that I've been running in these shocks will be close enough to get this set up, and I can go from there. Now, if we go back around here to the back of the truck, we're going to get ready to raise this thing to ride height and then charge all 4 of the back shocks. Now, before I raise the truck up, I've gone ahead and I put 200 PSI in each shock. And the reason for that is so that the pistons and the oil and everything is compressed. Even though I raise the truck up, the pressure will drop down probably to, say, 170 pounds or whatever as I raise it up. But it'll keep everything, compressed together there with that nitrogen pressure. You don't want to go pulling these shocks apart with no pressure in them. Or so I've read. Now, if I remember correctly, the last time I was setting these things up was around 10 or 11 inches of shock shaft showing, and then 385 PSI in the rear shocks. So I'll set you guys up over in the corner here, and I'll just video a little bit of me moving this hose around and charging everything up. First thing we're going to do is pick it up to ride height. Well, I've got this tube inserted in the back of the chassis right here, and it's just sitting on the jack. So the jack technically is holding the truck here at this ride height, we'll call it, which technically it's a little bit over ride height. This measurement from the top of this puck to the bottom of the shock is sitting at 13 inches. So what I'm going to do is throw about 385, 390 PSI in all 4 shocks. Then I'll lower the jack down, jump up on the back of the truck, see if I can get it to settle down. If it'll settle down to about 12 inches in that measurement, I'll call that good for now. It's definitely good enough to start fine-tuning from there, and I will be able to get started on addressing the bracketry stuff that I need to get going on these shocks here. So what I'll do is start by opening. I'm going to throw a little bit of pressure on the lines here. Got my bottle opened up. I'll set the regulator at 390 pounds. Then I can open this valve right here and charge my hoses to that, where the regulator's at. So this gauge, I've got a gauge that shows the pressure in the bottle, a gauge that shows what I've got my regulator set at, and then this gauge right here shows what the pressure in the shocks currently is, even with this valve closed. So right now I'm sitting at 380. I'm going to crack these high pressure Schrader valves open. And now I can open this valve and charge those 2 shocks to that 385 PSI. Now with this valve shut, I'm able to close the valves on the shocks and then break the lines loose, bleed the pressure off the lines, and move them to the other 2 shocks without messing with any of the rest of the bottle. Like we got some lovely weather coming in tonight. Now, normally, since I was already on that side, I would have moved the lines over there, but I'll come over here on the camera side. We're going to crack this line loose, bleed the pressure off of the line on both lines, actually, and then we'll move them to the other shocks. And I think I'll go ahead and charge those lines again, just so we didn't get a drop in what's already in the shocks. And again, we'll go to the regulated pressure of 385 pounds. You can kind of hear, I heard the jack kind of creak a little bit there, so it's taking the weight off of the jack. So now what I'll do is close those high pressure valves. Now we'll lower the jack and see if it will, if I can get it to settle down that inch or so. And it's just a touch under 12 inches. I think that's good enough for what I'm going to do for now. I'm going to move on to that bracketry, call it good. If I need to adjust the ride height, that's actually really pretty easy to do. Now that I know about how many PSI, how much pressure to put in those shocks. So on to the next part.
Approximately 10 hours later.
Well, I'm pretty much jumping right to the end here. As you can see, I've got the little links built in here to tie the two shocks together. I did attempt to drill these in this area right here and get more clearance for the rod ends here. But what happened is it moved this rod end out about an inch and maybe like an inch and a half on the front shocks. So all I really had to do was actually add about an 1/8 inch spacer back here behind the rod ends, and actually got enough clearance to fit down in the saddle of these clamps. Now I did take the clamps and remove them off the shocks where that pinch bolt is, or the clamp bolt that's in here. Previously in the video, if you look, you can see where it's on the outside here. I simply took the inside that is threaded and drilled that hole all the way through and continued the threads all the way through. So the clamping bolt is coming in from the back, pinching these clamps down onto these shock bodies and the reservoir bodies. And then this bolt here just threads into what's left of that area. So I don't have to, if I decide to take this bolt out, it's not messing with the clamping feature on this unit. So it's pretty easy to work on. I don't have to mess with it. I've done these little links on the channel before in previous videos. Pretty simple. This is just a piece of 5/8 round stock drilled and tapped for 3/8. This end is left-hand thread, got right-hand thread, so they're adjustable. It's essentially just a small turnbuckle. And as you can see, it's got both of these tied together. And really what's limiting these reservoirs from twisting and turning into the chassis or into this anti-sway bar mount or this anti-sway bar arm is the simple fact that there's only a certain amount of movement in these rod ends. So once it gets to a certain point, they pretty much just bind. And there's really no real load to those joints. I mean, there is a possibility something could flop around and break one of these, but that's a pretty simple repair if that's all that goes wrong. Now we'll go up to the front. I'll show you those real quick, and then we'll wrap up this video. Now here on the front, you can see they're pretty much the same. I did have to build a little bit bigger spacer back here for this area because of the way this thing is kicked around. It's pretty much at the limit of this joint right here. But there is still a bit of movement. But everything should clear. Again, I did try to do the mounting holes right here, but having that rod end out here is just asking for the tires to get into it. If you take a look at pretty much any competitive monster truck that's out there running, most of them that have anything on the outside of the shocks as far as an external bypass tube or anything like that, or some of them actually have the reservoirs kicked out here in line with the shocks. Most of those that have anything like that will have black marks on those tubes or on those reservoirs from the tires getting into them. So I'm just, trying my hardest to keep everything tucked in as much as I can. And by having these set in these saddles of the clamps, actually is, I can't get any tighter than that. Thought about putting them on the back side, but it gets pretty tight with the chassis on clearance back in here. Now, just a little bit ago when I was doing the ride height and charging the shocks, I had mentioned that the fronts are 345 PSI and the rears ended up being 390. So what I'm going to do from now on is actually just round up to the best number. So these are going to end up being 350 PSI and the rears are going to be 400 PSI. And then I'm just going to adjust that ride height at where I'm going to set that pressure. So let's say on the rear, since we talked about the rear the most, I had this set up at 13 inches. I charged them to 390 is what I ended up actually charging them to. And they settled down to 12 inch. So what I need to do is go drive the truck and see where they actually settle out at and then adjust from there. So what I will do is actually charge these to 400 PSI to that round number, go drive the truck and see where it settles in at. If it settles in too high, say it doesn't really settle down from that 13 inches, or it creeps up, then what I'll do is lower the amount of shock, the amount of chrome there, and still charge it to that 400 PSI. Just use a known number and a known measurement every time that I check or adjust the shocks and see how that works out for me. Now, as far as actually testing this stuff, I think my next day's off, we're gonna back the truck out, tire it up. There's an old loading dock down the street from the shop here. We'll go down there and that loading dock's probably 50 years old, so the dirt's kind of sloughed off of it. It's a lot like a nice racing lane jump. So I think we'll go and hit that, see how the shocks feel, see how the ride height settles in, and really just, kind of do some adjusting from there. If all of the testing goes smoothly those first couple days off, that should leave me with 2 or 3 days to get everything loaded up and ready to go to Havasu. That show is May 1st and 2nd, and I believe there's going to be 4 or 5 trucks there. So I'm really hoping that this new shock package and the effort that I put into it this week pay off, and we can put on a really good show down there. Of course, I'm going to do my best to bring you guys along for that. As for this video though, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I'll leave you guys with me time-lapse torquing all of these 3/4 inch bolts. All of those ended up going 375 foot-pounds, and everything on the truck should be pretty much good to go. As always, thanks for watching. Have a good one.
Yeah.
Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. How about your test 1, 2?
Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2.
Okay, 15 seconds is long enough. How about you? Yeah?
20.